Remember the last time you looked at a job posting only to have your heart sink as you scrolled through a never-ending list of required skills? React, Next.js, Tailwind, animations, the list goes on, and it can feel overwhelming not knowing where to start or what skills to learn next, right? It feels like a cruel game where no matter how hard you work, the goalposts keep getting pushed further and further away. It can be enough to make you want to give up before you even get started. What if, instead of feeling like you're always just one more skill away from landing your dream job, you could build something incredible in a single video? A project so good it rivals the stunning animated landing pages for top tech companies like Linear or Chronicle. In this video, we're going to do just that. This won't be just another cookie cutter website. Together, we're going to create something that could be the difference between your portfolio blending in and standing out from the crowd. Something that makes recruiters pause, sit up, and take notice of your work. And trust me, this isn't just another basic tutorial, because in today's job market, being just another developer isn't enough. Companies are looking for people who can bring designs to life with fluid animations and pixel-perfect precision. That's exactly what we'll be doing today. We'll be using some of the most in-demand tools in modern web development, including Next.js, React, TailwindCSS, and Framer Motion. We'll harness the power of React and Next.js to build a rock-solid foundation, using components to keep our code clean and organized. We'll use Tailwind CSS to craft beautiful, responsive designs that adapt flawlessly to any screen. And then we'll bring the entire experience to life with Framer Motion, adding those subtle professional animations that make users go, wow. By the end of this video, you'll transform from someone who can code basic websites into someone who can craft engaging user experiences. Think about that next job interview. Imagine pulling out your portfolio, showing this project, and confidently explaining not just what you built, but why you built it that way. That's the kind of experience that gets you hired. This is your chance to create something that truly stands out from the crowd. So are you ready to stop watching other developers create amazing websites and start building them yourself? If so, let's dive in and create something incredible together. Before we begin, let me show you exactly what we'll be building. Starting in the Hero section, you'll learn how to create stunning designs that gracefully animate onto the page. And here's a fun surprise. We've added an Easter egg where users can actually drag the designs around, creating an interactive playground that visitors won't expect, but will love discovering. Moving down, we'll build a logo ticker where company logos smoothly scroll across the screen in an infinite loop, a subtle touch that adds movement and life to the page. In the introduction section, we'll implement an impressive text effect where the words will animate in perfect sync with the user's scroll position, creating a captivating reading experience that keeps visitors engaged. The features section is where we'll really bring the magic. Every single feature comes alive with its own micro interaction. These small but impactful animations make the interface feel responsive and delightful to use. For the integration section, we'll create two independently animating columns, adding depth and visual interest to what could otherwise be a static display. When we get to the FAQs, you'll learn how to implement buttery smooth expand and collapse animations that make the interface feel polished and professional. And finally, in our call to action section, we'll create an eye-catching effect where words gracefully animate across the screen, and when users hover over them, they slow down and transform with a beautiful color transition. Before we jump in, I want to make sure you have everything you need to succeed. I've created a comprehensive starter bundle for this project, and yes, it's completely free. This bundle includes all the essentials you'll need: a pre-configured starter template, professional designs, optimized images, and every icon used in this project. This way, you can focus on learning and building without getting stuck on setup or hunting down assets. You'll find the download link for this free bundle in the description below. Now, this is part 2 of this project, so if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I've dropped the link in the description below. Enough talk, let's build. Now that we're done with the integration section, let's go ahead and move on to our FAQs. So you can see we have some very similar design aspects we've been seeing in some other sections. Have our tag, we've already created that. We have a title, and then we have each of these FAQs that we're listing down here along with our icons. So this shouldn't be too complex, certainly on the mobile view. In the tablet, let's see if anything changes. So in the tablet, we have the same kind of design elements, but a little bit wider. And then on the desktop view, we have very similar to the tablet view, just making sure that it's centered on the page. So this should be a pretty fun section to work on. Let's go ahead and dive into the code. Coming into our code, let's go into our source and find our FAQs section. It looks like it's going to be this FAQs. So we have an array of FAQs, each with a question and answer. And then we have this exported default function FAQs that exports this section onto the page. So in order to get that hooked up, let's go into our app directory and go into our page and import that FAQs component from @section/FAQs, and then drop it onto the bottom of our page like so, and go ahead and give that a closing tag. If we've done that correctly, as we scroll down, we should see the word FAQs showing up where that section has been inserted. So that looks like it's all wired up. Let me go ahead and close my page.tsx and come back to my FAQs section. We want to go ahead and put the content of this on the page first. So I'm going to replace my div tag with a semantic section tag. We're going to have a div with a class name of container to wrap our content. And then inside of that container, we're going to have the tag component that we've already created that's going to say FAQs. Below that, we're going to have the title, which is probably going to be an H2, a semantic H2, and it's going to say questions. We've got answers. And we're going to wrap a span tag around answers because we know we're going to style that with that lime color instead of the normal white for the titles. Now for the FAQs themselves, we know we're probably going to want to put these in a div and then have a separate div for each of the FAQs. So I'm going to go ahead and map through our FAQs. So I'll say FAQs.map. And for each FAQ, we're going to go ahead and show some JSX in the form of a div. And that div is going to have a key, and that key is just basically going to be the FAQ.question for now. That'll work perfectly. Inside of the FAQ div, we know we're going to have a div to hold the title. So that title is probably going to be a semantic H3, and we'll say FAQ.question. Beside that question, we are going to have our icon. In order to grab that icon, let's go into our assets/images and find our plus.svg, and then we're just going to copy and paste that into our page. It's going to allow us to do a little bit more with styling. So we know that we're going to need to change any HTML to JSX. We can go ahead and save that and come over and see what else we need to change. So we'll need to change stroke width and stroke line cap to their JSX equivalents to get that to work. But now we should have our plus, and we can go ahead and color that just by adding text lime 400, and that should enable us to color that. And then below our title or our question, we are going to have our answer. So I'm going to go ahead and put that below this div in a paragraph, and we're going to say FAQ.answer. Now that we have all the content on the page, it's time for us to start styling it up. So let's come up to our section tag and go ahead and add a class name here. So we're going to say class name equals PY24 to give it 96 pixels of padding top and bottom. Our tag should be centered, so we'll go ahead and wrap that in a div, and we'll go ahead and give that div a class name of flex justify center to push that towards the center of the page. For our title, we're going to give it similar styles to what we've had for our other titles. It's going to be text 6XL font medium. To give it some spacing from our tag, we can just say MT6. And we'll also say text center to make sure that the text is aligned towards the center of the page. For our span tag here, we'll give that a class name of text lime 400 to give it the right color. For our FAQs, we know that each of our FAQs is going to have some styles as well. So we'll say class name here. We'll say BG neutral 900 to give it the right background color. We'll also say rounded 2XL to give that the right border radius. We'll also give it a border and border white /10 for the border color of white with 10% opacity. And then P6 will give it 24 pixels of padding, and that will ensure we have each of our FAQ cards. Now for the wrapper around our FAQs, we'll go ahead and give this div a class name of MT12 to ensure that we have the right amount of spacing from our title. And then we can use this to flex our FAQs by saying flex call and then gap 6 should ensure we have the right amount of spacing in between our different FAQs. Down in our FAQs, let's continue to style these up so we know that our wrapping div around the title and the icon is going to be flexed. So I'm going to say class name equals flex there, and that should ensure that that is properly flexed. And then our SVG, if we can give that a class name, we want to ensure that it's not shrinking. So I'm going to say flex shrink 0 to ensure that it is not resizing improperly. Up in our flex container, we can go ahead and give this justify between to ensure that our icon is always showing up to the very right of our FAQ. And then we can also say items center to ensure that it's aligned center with our icon. For our title, we'll want to add a couple of class names here as well. We'll just say font medium, and actually that might be the only one, just to make that a little bit bolder. And then for our answer, we'll go ahead and give this a class name of text white 50, and that'll ensure that it's a little bit lighter. Now we'll probably want to wrap this paragraph in a div because we are going to be animating this in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that div is what's going to provide the spacing as well. So I'm going to say MT6, and that should give that the right amount of spacing. Now, as you can see from our design, not every one of these FAQs is going to be selected at the same time. So I think the best way to handle this before we get into our animation is simply to have a variable to say which one is selected. So I'm going to say const selected index is equal to 0, and then we can make some modifications if the index is equal to the one that it's currently showing as we map over our FAQs. So let me go ahead and pull out FAQ index as well. That'll give us an index that we can look at versus our selected index to see which answer should be showing. So as I scroll down here, I can go ahead and give this div right here a class name of TW merge so that we can merge in some dynamic classes. And then the class that we're going to merge is when the selected index is not equal to the FAQ index, then we can go ahead and add on the hidden rule. The only other difference from my design that I'm seeing is that if it is actually selected, we do rotate that X by a little bit. So we'll go ahead and add that on as well. We'll just go ahead and add that directly to this class name here. I'm going to say TW merge here as well. And then we can say that if the selected index is equal to the FAQ index in this case, then we also want to add on a rotate 45 just to make sure that our icon is being properly rotated. Now that we have our coded template looking pretty similar to our design, let's go ahead and take a look and overlay our reference image just to see if anything is different. So as I scroll up and down, it looks like we hit this right on the money, which is a great sign. So I'm going to pull my reference image back out to the side and move on to our other responsive views. I'm going to pull my browser window out just a little bit, go ahead and close out this plus.svg and close the sidebar to give my code a little bit more room over here. As I look at my tablet view, let's see if there are any differences. It does look like the title does get constrained a little bit, as well as our FAQs. It looks like there's constraints around both of those. So the first one's going to be the title. Let's make sure there's a max width on this. That's going to be max width extra large, and then MX auto should ensure that it still stays in the center of the screen even with that constraint. And then for our div that surrounds our FAQs, it looks like that has the same constraint. So we'll say max width extra large here as well, and MX auto should hopefully ensure that that also stays towards the center of the page. I don't think anything else changed here, so let's double check this by pulling our reference image over once again, and it looks like we're once again right on the money. Now, we didn't change anything that would have affected our mobile view, I don't think, but let me go back real quick and just double check, and it doesn't look like it. So we'll continue on to our desktop view. For our desktop view, we have our FAQs. We're going to pull this out just a little bit more. Let's see if we can get a good side-by-side view of these sections. It looks like we're already right on the money with our FAQs, so let me go ahead and pull my reference image over, overlay it on top of my coded template, and it looks like, yes, indeed, there was nothing we actually had to do for the desktop section. So with that, we have completed this section, at least statically, and it's time to move on to the next section. Moving down below the FAQ section, we get to our call to action section. So this is actually going to be some scrolling text down here that you don't fully see in the mobile version until it actually starts to scroll, but that's fine, and someone should be able to click this and go to a link. On the tablet view, you're going to see that a little bit bigger, obviously you can see more of that text and it's going to be an even better effect. And then on the desktop, it's going to be even better because of course you're going to see it multiple times as it's scrolling over. So let's figure out how to create this section over in our code. Coming into our code, let's go ahead and find the call to action section in our sections and just take a look at what's in here. It's exporting the default function of call to action. We just need to go ahead and import this component into our page. Let's go into source/app/page.tsx and let's import the call to action section from @/sections/call to action, and then just drop it in our page like we have the other ones with call to action here at the bottom. As soon as we've done that, as long as we've done that correctly, we should see the words call to action, which I do, which means I'm going to close out my page.tsx, come back into my call to action section, and get started creating this section. There's not going to be a ton of content, obviously, in the section to drop, but we are going to do a couple of things here. We are going to create a semantic section tag, and this one's going to be a little bit unique because this is actually not going to have a container surrounding our content. We're just going to go directly into our content. So we need to go ahead and create a div to hold our content, and then we need to create the span tag for the star. So we'll say span, and then we'll put our star in there. That's ampersand hash 10038 like it is for our other ones. I'm going to go ahead and hit save to see if I see that star showing up, which is small, but I do. And then beside that, we're going to have the additional text, which is going to be another span tag, and it's going to say try it for free. Now that we've done that, in order to make this div loop over and over, we probably need to go ahead and give this some sort of looping array. So I'm going to say array.from, we'll say length 10, and then we'll map over that array, going ahead and taking just the index, which is going to be the second argument to this function, and then going ahead and returning the JSX that we've already created. So I'm just going to bring this up to here. The only difference is this JSX is going to have a key, and the easiest key is going to be that index. So I'm just going to say the key is equal to the index that we're passing in. After we do that and save it, we should see a bunch of words here, which means we just need to go ahead and make sure that all of these different try it for free call to actions are aligned left to right instead of top to bottom. To get started with our styles, let's come back into our section tag and go ahead and give this a class name of py24 to give it the padding for the section top and bottom. And then we also probably want to wrap this whole thing in a div just to hold in our content. So this div is what's going to stop everything from overflowing to the left and right. So we're going to say class name equals overflow X clip. We could also do overflow hidden, but this will work just fine. And then we're also going to give this a little bit of padding because you can see that our star doesn't directly touch the side there. So we're going to say P4 just to give it that 16 pixels of padding. We also want to flex this div. So we'll say flex there to make sure that our words go left to right. And then inside of our overflow div, we want to create another div to handle the space in between all of these different call to actions. So we're going to create another div here. This one is going to be flexed. And then to get these words so that they'll flow off the screen, we can just come up to our parent div and say flex. And then in the child div, we say flex none. And that basically will get them so they can flow as far off the screen as they need to, depending on the size of our words. After we've done that, let's go ahead and create the gap between those. So it's going to be gap 16 for 64 pixels of space in between each of these. We'll control the font size with text 8XL, which is going to be the font size that we see. Excuse me, text 7XL. Looks like it's a little bit smaller than that. We want the font weight to be font medium. And I think that will be it for this wrapping flexed div for now. And then inside each of our actual call to actions themselves, we'll add a class name here. We're also going to flex these, make sure the items are centered and that they also have a gap of our 64 pixels in between the star and the try it for free text. We know that the text is going to be that lime color. So we're going to say class name equals text lime 400. And that should change that to be the correct color. And I think that should be, as it stands right now, pretty close to our design. So what we'll do is we'll come up to our reference image and go ahead and overlay that to see how close we got. And right now it definitely looks like it's right on the money. I'm just going to go ahead and scroll up and down just a little bit so we can see. But yes, I'm not seeing any blurriness. So I think we have this exactly as it looks in our design, which means we can move on to our other responsive views. In our tablet, as we scroll up a little bit so we can see this a little bit better, it looks like the text size does move up a little bit in the tablet view. So I'm going to come here and say that my text 7XL should have a medium modifier, and we'll add in a text 8XL to just pop up that font size in this particular view. It does appear for some reason that the star does stay the same though. So we'll go ahead and add a text 7XL onto our star just to make sure that that is staying the same size as the text size for this continues to grow. Let me pull out my browser window a little bit just so we can get a little bit better look of our side-to-side design and template. And then I'm going to go ahead and close out our sidebar just to give our code a little bit more room here as well. So it looks like it's pretty close. Let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see if there's any other differences that we haven't accounted for. But right now I'm not seeing any, which means I think we're good on this responsive view. Let's move up to our desktop and see if anything needs to change up there. Over in our desktop view, I'm going to pull out my browser a little bit more so we can see this just a little bit better. And it's looking like it's pretty close. So let's go ahead and overlay this and see if there's any changes that we need to make on this responsive view as well. And after overlaying that, it doesn't look like it. I'm seeing these exactly line up. So I think for our static portion of this section, just getting the static design correct, I think we're good on all of our sizes. So that means we can move on to the footer. For the last section of the page, we just have our footer, which is going to have the logo and a couple of links stacked on top of each other. Over in the tablet responsive view, you can see that it now has the logo to the left and the links to the right. And in the desktop view, we're just spreading that out a little bit, but still within our container for this particular size. So it should be a pretty easy section to create. And this is actually the only section of the page where we're not going to have any kind of animation. So once we create it, we're going to be done with that particular section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump over to our code. In order to hook up our footer, we just need to go ahead and go to the section/footer, and we can see that we have this exported default function here. So we can come into our app, come into our page, and go ahead and import our footer from @section/footer and drop it in as the last section of the page. After we've done that, we should see the word footer here at the bottom. I do see that, so I can come back into my footer and start creating this section. I'm going to start by replacing my div with a semantic section tag. We are going to have a container for this one, so I'm going to say div class name equals container. And then we know that we're going to have two separate pieces. We're going to have our layers logo and we're going to have our footer links. So I'm going to wrap those both in a div, and we're going to have the two separate divs for that, one for the logo and one for those links. In order to drop in my logo, I'm going to import it. So I'm going to import my logo. I'm going to just call this logo image from @/assets/images/logo.svg. And then I can use next image to go ahead and show that SVG because I'm not really changing it at all. So I'm going to say image here and hit enter there to import image from next image, have the source set to my logo image, and then the alt tag is going to be layers logo. And let me go ahead and give that a closing tag to finish that up. I see that logo there, which is a good sign. So I'm going to go into my div and make sure we continue putting in the content. So we're going to loop through these footer links inside of a semantic nav tag. So I'm going to say footer links.map and go with link, and then we'll show some JSX for each of those links. And that's going to be a simple link with an href of link.href. And inside that link will be the link.label. After I save that, I should see those showing up as well, which means it's time for us to come back and go through our styles for this particular section. Now, this section has a little bit less padding than the others, so I'm going to give this a class name of PY16. That's only going to be 64 pixels of padding top and bottom. And then inside our container, we do want to make sure that we flex these in the column directions. So I'm going to say class name equals flex call, and then justify center should align those to the center, or excuse me, items center right here. And we can also add a gap here to go ahead and split these. So I'm going to say gap 6 to ensure that those get split by 24 pixels. We need to slightly modify our nav links here as well. So I'm going to give these a class. I'm actually going to add it to the links themselves. So I'm going to say class name and say text white 50 and text small should make those a little bit smaller. And then for my nav, we'll go ahead and give this a class name of flex with a gap of 24 pixels as well, just to spread those out a little bit. After I've done that, let me go ahead and scroll up and down a little bit to see how close we look to our design. It looks like it's right on the money, but you never know until you pull over the reference image. So let me go ahead and take my reference image, overlay it here, and it looks like it's perfect versus our design, which is a great sign that we are done with our mobile view and it's time to move up to our tablet view. As we move up to our tablet view, of course, I'm going to give this a little bit more room. Go ahead and close down my sidebar and take a look at what needs to change for this responsive view. So the first thing I'm seeing is that instead of top and bottom, now we're splitting these left and right. And that's just going to be as simple as changing what happens to our column flexed div. So I'm going to say at the medium size, we're going to say flex row. And then we want our items to say centered, but we then want to also say medium justify between, and that should ensure that we see those moving towards the left and the right. After we've done that, we simply need to overlay our reference image once again to ensure that we have everything aligned perfectly. And it looks like we do. So I'm going to pull my reference image back out to side by side and go up to my desktop view. In this view, I don't think anything's changed, but we want to ensure that by going ahead and overlaying our reference image on top of this code as well, and everything looks perfectly aligned, which means that quickly our footer is done and it's time for us to come back and look at all of the great animations we're going to add to this landing page to really make it pop. From now on, we're going to be focusing on specifically interactions, which means we're done with our design. I'm going to go ahead and take my reference image and reset it on all of my responsive views so that we don't have that reference image kind of muddying the waters here. We're going to be focusing specifically on the interactions that we need to add to each particular section. And to do this, I'm also going to go ahead to the top of my browser and go ahead and make sure this is set to 100% so we get a nice, clear view of what we're doing as we're changing our code to get these sections to be interactive. In order to get started, let's go ahead and go into our source directory, go into our sections, and let's open up our navbar.tsx so that we can start to put in some of the animations for this section. The first thing I'm going to do is just focus on making this navbar sticky. So as you can see, as we scroll down the page, the navbar doesn't go with us as we scroll, and we'd like to change that and make this a sticky navbar. So I'm going to come up into my section div and I'm going to add a couple of class names here. The first one is going to be sticky to make it position sticky. We're also going to say top 0, and that should make sure that it stays at the top of the page. Now, as I scroll down, you should see that the nav bar does stay in place. However, we still have a couple of problems. One of those problems is the fact that it doesn't sit above our content. So instead, it's layered below our other content. We'd like it to sit above our content, and we can do that with a Z index. So I'm going to set this to Z50. That should set the Z index to 50, which is greater than anything else on the page, and that should ensure that it layers above all of our content. The second issue is that it goes over the content. The background doesn't get blurred, so we end up seeing this kind of janky effect going on. We'd like to not see that, so what we'll do is we'll add a background color to this. Now this won't be directly to the section wrapper, this will be to the grid that has the border. So on this one, we'll go ahead and say BG neutral 950 /70 for 70% opacity. And let me scroll down again and see what that looks like. So now the background does definitely darken up a bit, but now we'd like it to also be blurred so that we have a nice glassy type effect on this. And then to do that, we'll just add the class of backdrop blur and hit save. And that should add that nice blurred effect in the background. So now when we scroll down, we should see our nav bar has that nice background blur that keeps it above all of our content. Now that we have that taken care of, the next thing I'd like to do is make it possible for someone to click the navbar button and have the navbar menu items actually show up. And in order to do that, we should add some state to the navbar saying whether it's open or not. So I'm going to come down here inside my navbar component and say const is open, set is open is equal to React's use state with a default value of false. Now, as soon as I save that, you are going to see that you are going to get an error in Next.js that says you're importing a component that needs use state. This only works in a client component. So to fix that error, we need to use this use client directive that it tells us to. So I'm going to just go ahead and copy this, come to the top of my file and say use client, hit save, and that should allow our client component to properly render and allow us to use the is open state right here. Now, when this navbar is open, what we'd like to do is we'd like to change this SVG icon in such a way that it changes from this hamburger menu that you see now to an X. In order to do that, what we're going to do is try and manipulate these lines to turn them, and then we're going to make the middle one actually disappear when this is actually open. So let's first figure out which the middle line is. So you can see that if we comment out, for example, the first line right here and hit save, you can see that the middle line actually disappears. So this is actually the middle line is the first one that's listed here in our SVG. So I'm just going to move that down so I can see my Y1 value on the first one is now equal to 6. The Y1 on the second one is now equal to 12, and the Y1 on the third one is now equal to 18. So that shows me that they're now in order. And when I comment out my second line, you can see that it's now the second line that's disappearing. And I'm going to go ahead and comment that back in. What we can do is we can add a class name on that center line and say class name equals, and then use our TW merge function in order to add some classes on that based on the state of our component. So I can say if it is open, we can add on the opacity 0, and that should make it completely hide when it is open. Now, in order to test that, we need a way to change our state. Now, I could have come up here and manually change it, which I can go ahead and do now, but of course, we'd like to add a click handler here in a second. So I'm going to say is open true. We can see that the line disappears, and if I set it back to false, we can see that it comes back. Now, to have that automatically happen, all I need to do is add an on click handler onto my SVG. So I'm going to say on click, and when that happens, I'm going to run a function to set is open to the opposite of what it currently is. The opposite is going to be the not is open value. So I can just simply say set is open to not is open. So if it's true, it's going to turn it to false. And if it's false, it's going to turn it to true. So after I do that, as soon as I click this hamburger menu icon, you're going to see that the middle line shows up and disappears. That's the first step in making this an X, but of course the second step is going to be taking these two lines and rotating them sideways so that one faces down and the other faces up. So let's go ahead and add some class names onto line 1 and line 3 as well. So I'm going to say class name equals, and of course I'm going to use our same TW merge function to ensure that we can dynamically change these classes based on our state. For the first line, we need to go ahead and say if it is open is true, we're going to add on the rotate 45 and the negative translate Y1 to go ahead and pull it up by 4 pixels. And then for the last line, we're going to add a class name on there as well. We're going to say class name equals TW merge. And if it is open, once again, we're going to add on a negative rotate 45 degrees and a translate Y1 to move it down by 4 pixels. The reason that these aren't translating correctly is because we need to, instead of rotating them from the center, we need to rotate them from the left. So I'm also going to add in a default class here of origin left, and that should ensure that the first one rotates from the left. And the same thing is going to be true of the last one. I'm going to add in a default class of origin left here as well, and just go ahead and add a comma in there, and that should allow it to add this on no matter what. Now you can see that we have an X when it is open, and if I click that, we go back to the hamburger menu icon, but that's not a very good transition. We're not getting any kind of transition in between. We're just getting one state to the other state, and I don't really like that. We'd like to add in some transition classes, so let's go ahead and do that for each of our lines. Let's go ahead and say transition, and then we'll see if that actually does transition that first line as well as our last line. Let's go ahead and add transition into there. And then our third one, we'll go ahead and add a default class of transition as well. So that should hopefully add in a little bit of transition. Let's go ahead and check it out. Okay, great. So we see that our middle line is transitioning out. Our first line is transitioning to our rotated value. And our third line is transitioning to our negative rotated value. And we're getting a nice effect for our hamburger menu icon. The last thing we need to do for this navbar is actually make a mobile navigation that shows up when we click this button. So let's go ahead and figure out where we're going to put that navigation. So you can see that we have our container that's holding all of our nav, and then you have our grid that is holding our logo and our mobile navigation component. We'd like for the mobile nav to show up below that top grid here. So this is also holding right now our border. We're probably going to have to move the border out of this grid so that we can show the border around the navigation when it shows up as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to surround my current div with another div, and we're just going to basically decouple the border from the grid that's showing up here. So let me go ahead and fold my code back down, and then I'm going to move my border and border white 15 classes out of my grid and move them into a surrounding wrapper so we can also have that border surrounding our mobile navigation. The other thing we'll want to move out is our rounded class, because we're definitely going to want to have that surrounding our navigation as well. And I think for now, everything else should be fine. Maybe we'll go ahead and move out our background and backdrop blur as well to make sure that those are behind our mobile nav items. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and add in our static mobile nav item. So I'm going to add another div down here, and we're going to go through our nav links. So we'll say nav links.map. For each link, we're going to go ahead and return some JSX. So we're going to have some JSX in the form of a link tag with an href of link.href. We'll have a key tag of link.label. And we'll have a class name here that will fill in as soon as we see what these look like. And then, of course, in our A tag, we're going to have our link.label showing up here as well. Now we can see that we need to add some sort of class name to our wrapping div. So I'm going to give this a class name as well and say flex call to line those up top to bottom. And then we can say items center to get them towards the center. For each of those items, we can go ahead and add a little bit of padding to those as well. So I'm going to say class name equals py2, and that should ensure that they have a little bit of padding in between them. Now you're seeing this border radius is really large right now. And what we'd like to happen is for the border radius to essentially look like it's staying the same when we open up this mobile nav. So what I'm going to go back and do is say, instead of rounded full, we're going to essentially take the value that it was, which was half of 54 pixels, because this is about 54 pixels tall. We're going to say rounded 27 pixels, and that should hopefully keep that same border radius. We can kind of test that by saying, when this is open, we'll go ahead and show this div. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap an is open wrapper around this div and see what happens when that goes away. So we see is open is going to show it, and then when it's closed, it's going to hide it. But you can see that the border radius essentially looks the same when it's open as it does when it's closed, and that's definitely a good thing that we want here. Now, the other thing we'd like to happen for our nav links is to also show the login and sign up buttons below our mobile navigation links. So let's go ahead and put those here as well. I'm going to use my button component, and we're going to have our login button as well as our sign up button. We know that we need a variant for each of these. So the variant for this one is going to be secondary. The variant for this one is going to be primary. Let's go ahead and add those on there and see what they look like. And then we also want to add a class name to these because we want these to be, I think, full width. So it looks like instead of using py2 in between our mobile nav items, it might be better to instead take that off and go ahead and add a gap 4 in between here to kind of give those the same gap in between. And then we can also say py2 on this outer wrapping div, and that should hopefully add a little bit more padding. Or actually, I'm just going to go up to 4 because I think that looks a little bit better. Now, the last thing we'd like to do in this mobile navigation, just to add an extra level of polish, is to, instead of having it snap open and close like we see here, we'd like it to be able to animate open and close. And the way we can do that is with Framer Motion. Now, we have the animate presence component that Framer Motion gives us. Let me go ahead and talk about that for a second in case you haven't seen that or you don't know about it. I'm going to open up my bottom panel here and pull this up a little bit. And I'm going to go over to the Browse tab so we can talk about what this animate presence component is and what it does. So as you can see, if you want to animate components as they're added or removed from the React tree, we can wrap them in this animate presence component. And then we can basically just make sure that our interior ones are motion components, and then we can use them to basically animate them from an initial state to an animated state and then to an exit state. So that gives us the ability to fully control the life cycle of a component that we're animating as we're mounting it and unmounting it, essentially. This makes it really easy for us to do exactly what we want to do, which is be able to animate this mobile navigation as it shows and as it hides and goes off of the screen. So let me go ahead and close down my panel. I'm going to actually minimize it here a little bit and then close it down. And I'm going to slide my browser window back in, and then we'll see how we can do that with this animate presence component. So first I'm going to come up to the top of my file and import animate presence from Framer Motion. And as we saw in the docs, we'll also need a motion component. So I'm also going to import that motion components here. Now to use this, we'll need to say animate presence around whatever we're removing and adding to the DOM, which is going to be this div right here. And then we're going to put our ending animate presence around that and go ahead and hit save. Now for this to work, we also need this div inside of this to be a motion component as well. So we're going to switch this from a div to motion.div, and we're going to do the same thing with our ending div. We're going to replace it with a motion.div. After I hit save, let's just see what happens by default. We're probably going to change what happens, but let's see if anything changes. So let me go ahead and close this, open it back up. Okay, so far, nothing has changed because we haven't given this any props to tell it what to do at specific states. So we're going to have an initial state. We're also going to have an animate state, and we're going to have an exit state. So all of these are going to be things that we're going to want to animate too. And what I'm thinking here is that we could basically say that initially the height could be 0. So we'll say height 0 here. Then when we go into our animated state, we can say height auto. And then as we're exiting, we can go back down and animate to height 0. And of course, as we're doing that, I'm assuming we'll have to make sure that this div also has a class name that says overflow hidden. So I'm going to go ahead and add in overflow hidden here to ensure that we have that in place. So now that we have that, it should animate from 0 to auto and back to 0 when it exits the screen. So let's see if that actually happens. So we go ahead and click my X, and you can see that that did indeed happen. You saw the animate off. Let's look at it again. So you have animating on, animating off, animating on, and animating off. Now you can see that our animation, while decent, is still a little bit choppy. So I'm seeing a little bit of choppiness as these buttons come in and as they leave, and as our component completely animates off of the screen. And I think that's because essentially we have this padding that's being added to this div that has to basically instantly go off of the screen and instantly come back onto the screen. So what I'm going to do is, instead of having all of these classes that are controlling the layout of this mobile navigation on our motion div, I'm going to actually move them inside. So I'm going to create another div and go ahead and give this the class names that we saw up here. So I'm going to take all of these ones off, basically everything that controls the layout for our outer div, and move them inside of our animated div and see if that just cleans up our animation a little bit. I'm going to leave the overflow hidden on the outer one, of course, because I want to make sure that it hides all of its content as it animates on and off the screen. So let me go ahead and save that real quick, and let me go ahead and see what happens now that we have our overflow hidden rule here, and then we've moved all of our flexed rules into an inner div. So I'm going to go ahead and look at this again. And now you can see that this is just silky smooth as we animate this on and off the screen. So I really like what happened there. Now, one of the things you may notice as this is opening and closing is that the content is actually getting pushed down by our mobile nav, which definitely is not ideal. And it's something we would probably like to not have happen. Even as we scroll down, we can open this up, and you're seeing that it still kind of changes the layout of the page as this opens and closes, which definitely isn't ideal. So since we have this mobile navigation that is opening and closing, I think what might actually work better for this particular section is to change this, instead of a sticky section, to fixed instead, and make sure that the width is set to full so that it doesn't take up any space on the screen. So as I scroll down, I'm still going to get the same effect, but as I click open and closed, now this is not going to mess with the layout of my page at all, because it's just fixed to the top of my screen. Now, this is not going to take up as much space as it used to. We can account for that if we would like to by going ahead and increasing the padding on the top of the hero. But for now, I'm just going to leave that alone because I kind of like how the hero looks like this. So I'm just going to change this over to fixed. We can still scroll, we can still open and close this as we want to. So I really like where that's at. So now that we're done with the mobile navigation animation, let's go ahead and move over to our tablet animation for our mobile nav and see if there's anything else we need to do here. On our tablet view, I think the only real difference is that as we move up in size, of course, we don't want our rounded full to have changed. So I'm going to say at the medium size, we are going to change this to rounded full to ensure that we still have the same border radius as we get up into this tablet size. Then we won't have the ability to open up our mobile nav at this responsive size, and that's perfectly fine. We just don't want to have the mobile nav changing the way that this tablet size one works. And we're still going to have our fixed header. I think that is fine as well. And like I said, we can update the hero section padding, which I might go ahead and just do so that we have that changed. And I think what makes the most sense is probably to actually go back to the navbar and have the navbar add some extra padding at the bottom, just basically a dummy layer to take up the same amount of space that it was taking up when it was sticky. So what I'm going to do is basically just add a React fragment here. I'm going to come to the bottom of my fragment, and then I'm just going to add another div here. The sole purpose of this div is basically just to take up space. So I'm going to give this a class name of PB, and this padding bottom value here is just going to be the height that the nav bar was taking up before. In order to find out what the height should be, I'm going to go to my dev tools here, and we're just going to go to the elements and see if we can inspect this and see how tall it was. So you can see that this is 86 pixels. So I'm going to say that the padding bottom for this is just going to be 86 pixels, and that should take up the same amount of space as the sticky navbar did before. So now we get the same amount of space taken up at the top of our page. Of course, that value is going to change as we move up through our responsive sizes. So at the tablet size, that value is going to change to 98 pixels, it looks like. So I'm going to say at the medium size, let's go PB 98. And I can save that and see that update. And then at the desktop size, I don't think anything will have changed. Maybe the padding top and bottom may have. So let's see. This looks like it's going to be 130 pixels at the desktop size. So we'll say at the large size, we'll say PB 130 pixels. And that should ensure that we have the right padding for our dummy div that is essentially there just to take up space. Now that that's in place, I'm going to go ahead and close the dev tools out and just take one more look through my views. So you can see that that mobile view is looking good, the tablet view is looking great, and the desktop view is looking great as well. So that finishes up the animations for our navbar. Let's go ahead and move on to the hero section. The next thing we'd like to do is animate our hero section. So let me pull out my browser window and let's talk about this for 1 second. On the mobile and the tablet view, there's nothing for us to really animate, but on the desktop view, we get these great designs coming in from the left and the right hand side, as well as these cursors. And what we'd like to do is animate these in such a way that it looks like the cursor is actually placing the design on the screen and then moving out of the way. And after that, we'd like to be able to drag these designs around the screen and kind of play with them as a little Easter egg in this design. So before we do that, what I'd like to do is help you understand how we'd approach this from a framer motion perspective, because framer motion is going to allow us to do these kinds of animations. What we need to do, though, is we need to sequence some animations. So first, we'd like this left design, for example, to go from opacity 0 to 100. And we'd also like to sequence an animation where this cursor brings this in and then moves out of the way. In order to do that, we're going to use something from framer motion called animate. So let me talk about what that is real quick, and then we'll see how we can use this to do these sequence animations. So you can see I've gone to this animate function. As you can see down here, we have this animate sequences that allows us to accept complex animation sequences. And here's a little example of what you can do. So if I click this button, you can see that there's a sequence that happens where it turns it from a hamburger to an X, and then it has the sidebar come out, and then it animates in all of these navbar items, and it does the same thing on the way out. So essentially, if we pass it an array, we can have these sequences happening where it's going from one state to another state to another state, depending on how many different states we want this to work with. Now, there's an easy way to use this in React. You can actually use this use animate hook, and that will give us both the animate function, which we just saw, as well as a scope to drop in to any of our JSX components in order for us to easily hook this up. And then we just use effect to fire off the initial animation. So all that makes it really easy to use this animate function. And that's exactly how we're going to do it. Let me go ahead and close out those docs and dive into our code and see what we're going to do. I'm going to pull our browser window out just enough so that we can basically see this left-hand design. And we're going to concentrate on that one first, and then we'll come over and do the right-hand one and create the code for that. So in order to get started, let's go ahead and into our source and sections, go into our hero.tsx file and talk about the different things that we're going to have to do. The first thing we want to do is concentrate on our design one example image. That's going to be this div right here. Now, as you may know, in order to animate something with Framer Motion, we want those to be motion divs. So we're going to come up to the top of our file and import motion from Framer Motion. And we also want to make sure right off the bat that this is a client component so that we can do client effects. So I'm going to say use client at the top of our hero.tsx file, hit save, and that should allow that to be used. Now we are going to be focusing on the Andrea pointer. So I'm going to actually pull this up a little bit alongside my design one example image and leave the other two down below. And I'm going to change both of these divs, these outer absolutely positioned divs, into motion.divs. So I'm going to change this one to a motion.div and have an ending motion.div. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this second one, motion.div, and go ahead and change this to a motion.div as well. And go ahead and hit save. Now, nothing will have changed from that because, of course, it's not going to do anything until you tell it to animate something. So in order to start with those animations, we need to pull in our use animate hook. Now we're going to have a couple of different animations going on here. We're going to have a separate animation for our design image as well as our left pointer. So we're going to go ahead and create a use animate hook for each one of those to be able to animate those separately. So in order to get started using the use animate hook, I'm just going to go ahead and say const scope and animate is equal to use animate that hook, and that gives us both the scope and the animate function that we can use to animate something, including using sequences. Now, since we're going to be doing 4 different ones of these, I need to rename these variables. So I'm going to say this is the left design scope, and this is also the left design animate function, and then we can use that to basically differentiate that from our left pointer scope and animate function as well. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on the page as well. I'm going to say const left pointer scope and left pointer animate is equal to my use animate hook, and that provides us a different scope and animation function for that left pointer. Now to tie these together, all I need to do is say ref for my left design is going to be equal to my left design scope, and that will tie this animation function to this motion div that I just put that ref on. And the same thing is true of my left pointer. I can say ref equals left pointer scope, and that should tie this left pointer animate function to this motion div surrounding my left pointer. Now, in order to use these, all I need to do is create a use effect hook. So I'm going to say use effect, which is basically something that happens whenever the page loads or a variable changes. In this case, we're just basically doing it when the component loads by passing it an empty dependency list, and then we can just kind of fire off our animation function. So I'm going to copy and paste this and say left design animate, and we're going to give it a sequence to follow. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and transition the opacity of that left design from 0 to 1. So I'm going to say left design scope.current. So that's basically defining the current element. And we'll basically say that the opacity is going to go from 0 to 1. And we're also going to define the transition here. We're going to say that the duration is going to be 0.5. So essentially, we're having this animate from the opacity of 0 to 1 over that half a second duration. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and save my page, hit refresh, and see if we see that happen. And we do see that happen. However, the opacity goes from 1 to 0 to 1 because essentially we don't have any kind of initial value on this motion div. So I'm going to say initial is going to be opacity 0, and that ensures that it's opacity 0 until this animation fires. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that again, refresh my page, and see if we now have 0 until it fires. And that is true. Now we have the initial value of opacity 0, and then when this animation fires, then it goes from 0 to 1 over the first half a second. Now after that, we want something else to happen. We're gonna say left design scope.current. Again, we're still animating our left design, but now we want our X and Y values to change. So we're going to take the Y value to 0, and we're going to take the X value to 0. And we're also going to do this over a duration of 0.5 seconds. Now, we are taking these from 0, 0, but we don't have an initial value for these yet. So let me go ahead and add an initial value for these as well. So we're going to take the Y value from a value of 100 and the X value from a value of negative 100, and then basically take them to this 0, 0 here. And we can do the same thing with opacity. We actually don't need to animate it from 0 to 1. We can just go directly to 1 because we already have it at 0 at the beginning. So let me go ahead and save this and see what that looks like. If I refresh my page, let's see what happens with our animation. So you can see that first, our left design goes from an opacity of 0 to 1 over those first half a second, and then over the next half a second, it changes its X and Y transform from 100, negative 100 to 0, 0. So let's see that happen one more time. I'll go ahead and refresh my page, animates in, and then moves up. That's exactly what we want to happen. Now that we have that working, let's go ahead and work on our left pointer animation. So the left pointer, the initial value for this is also going to be opacity 0. So let's say initial equals opacity 0. And then we also want different X and Y values for it as well. So the initial on this one is going to be Y 100 and X negative 200. And that should put it over our design so it'll look like it's bringing in the design. So we go ahead and save that as well. It'll disappear from the page as soon as we hit refresh because, of course, now it's going to be opacity 0. So we need to animate it in, and then we need to move around our cursor to go ahead and animate it to its final position. So let's do that in our use effect hook. So for this one, we can say left pointer animate, and we'll run a sequence, and we'll use our left pointer scope.current. The first one is just going to be animating the opacity. So I'm going to say opacity is going to go to 1. And of course, it's going to do that over a duration of 0.5 seconds. Then the next part of the animation is going to be our left pointer scope.current again. And we're going to go from our Y value of 100 to a Y value of 0. So you can see we're doing something similar here. But for our X value, we're going to go from negative 200 to negative 100. So that's a little bit different. And then we're also going to have that happen over a duration of 0.5. And we need to put a comma in between there so that it's happy. And let's just go ahead and see what that looks like before we add our final animation. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, hit refresh, and see if our pointer looks like it's bringing in the design. And it does. It currently animates in with the design, looks like it's moving it up, and then we just need to add one more animation to get the cursor to move off the design. So I'm going to say left pointer scope.current, and this is going to be when our X value finally gets over to 0. But we're going to do something interesting here because we're also going to animate the Y value. So we're going to take our Y value and go from 0 to 16 to 0. And that's just going to make it look like it's a little bit more of a natural movement. So our Y value is actually going to change so that it just does that nice little flowy change there. And then that's also going to be over a duration of 0.5. And we're also going to add an easing value here of ease in, out. And that should ensure that looks very natural. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Let me go ahead and save my hero, refresh once again, and take a look at what that animation sequence does. Okay, so you see that nice little bounce. That was because we put that Y value in where it went from 0 to 16 to 0. And of course, the X value just goes ahead and changes and pulls it right over here. So let's look at that one more time. Let me hit refresh. You can see that it looks like it brings in the design and then the mouse moves off. That is the power of these animation sequences. They're really, really powerful. They can do some pretty creative stuff, and it's really up to our imagination how creative we can get with these animations. And now that we're done with our left pointer animation, let's move over to our right pointer animation. So we first need to bring in two more use animate hooks. So I'm going to bring those onto the page. I'm going to say const right design scope, and right design animate is going to be equal to use animate. And the same thing is going to be true. I'm going to say const right pointer scope, and right pointer animate is going to be equal to use animate. And then we can use those inside of our use effect hook to affect the right design and the right pointer. Now these are going to have slightly different values, but they're going to do something very similar. So you can scroll over so we can see that. We do need to change out these divs to motion divs. So let me go ahead and do that real quick. I'm going to say motion.div for this right design, and then I'm going to say ending motion.div for that. And for my Brian pointer, I'm going to say motion.div around that, and we're going to have an ending motion.div there as well. We need to add in our scopes. So I'm going to say the ref on this one is equal to left design scope, And the ref on the pointer is going to be equal to left pointer scope, and that should tie those two together. Coming back down to my ref, I see that I made a mistake. That shouldn't be the left design scope. That should be the right design scope and the right pointer scope. My bad on that. So after those are fixed, let's scroll up here and let's start to use our right design animate and our right pointer animate functions. The first one I'm going to do is my right design animate. And this function is going to take in an array, which is going to be our sequence. The first part of that sequence is going to be right design scope.current. And we're also going to change this to opacity, an opacity of 1. And we're also going to have that be over a duration of 0.5. But in this case, we're also going to add in a little bit of a delay because we want to delay this right design animation until this left pointer animation has fully finished. And that happens over 1.5 seconds because you have this first one that's happening over half a second, then another half second, then another half second. So we want to delay this by 1.5. So I'm going to say delay is going to be equal to 1.5. And that should ensure that the opacity doesn't animate in until this other one is completely done. And I just realized that I also need my initial opacity to be 0 in order for this to work. So let's go ahead and set that value down on my right design scope. I'm going to say initial is going to be equal to opacity of 0. Let me go ahead and save that. And then we'll refresh our page and see if that animates in. Okay, so we see that right design is animating in, which is a good sign. Let's also go ahead and set our initial X and Y values for this. So I'm going to say that the initial X value is going to be 100 and the initial Y value is also going to be 100. So I'm going to go ahead and save those. And then we can do our second part of our animation sequence to animate those to the right spot. So the second part of the sequence is going to be right design scope.current, where we're going to animate the X value to 0 and the Y value to 0. And we're going to set that over a duration of 0.5. And after I save that, let's just test that out to make sure that works. So I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh here. We should see it animate in and then move. So there's the animation and there is the movement. So that sequence is working well. Now we just need to get our pointer looking like it's bringing this design in as well and then moving off the design very similarly to how we did the other pointer. So in order to do that, we need to come down to our pointer scope div and then go ahead and add an initial value to this as well. This initial value is going to be equal to opacity of 0, an X value of 275 pixels, and a Y value of 100 pixels. And that should put that in the right spot initially for that pointer. So for our sequence animation for that, we need to use our right pointer animate function. So I'm going to say right pointer animate. And the first part of that sequence for our pointer is going to be using the right pointer scope.current. We're going to animate the opacity to 1, and we're going to do it over a duration of 0.5 seconds with the same delay of 1.5. After that, we're going to animate the X and Y value for that. So we're going to say right pointer scope.current, animating the X value to 175 and the Y value to 0. And we're also going to do that over a duration of 0.5. And that should look like it's moving the design at that point. So let's go ahead and save this and make sure that that's working well. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page. We are going to have to wait for that initial delay to happen. Then they should animate in and it should look like it's moving up the design, which it currently does. And then for our last part of our animation, that's where we do our right pointer scope.current, and that's where we move X and Y to 0. So I'm going to move X to 0. And for my Y value, I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to make it look a little more natural by animating this from 0 to 20 to 0. And we're going to do both of those over a duration of 0.5 seconds. So let's see that all together. Let me go ahead and pull my browser window all the way out and let's see the full effect of this animation. So I'm going to hit the refresh button and you can see this happen live. My hero animates in, then the other design animates in. You can see that my cursor animates over to the right spot. So let me see that one more time. I hit refresh one more time and we'll see that happen. And that's a great looking animation. It really adds a lot of flavor to this page. The only other thing we want to be able to do is after that animation happens, we want to give the user the ability to drag those designs around if they so desire. In order to do that, all we need to do is add to our images the drag prop that will allow these images to be draggable, but it's not going to work unless we also say that the image itself is not draggable, just the motion div. So on my image, I also have to say draggable equals false, and that should ensure that they don't go around dragging the image itself. They're actually dragging this motion.div. To do the same thing on my other motion.div that's holding my image, I just need to add the same props. So let me come in here and add the drag prop, drag, and then for my image, I also need to say draggable equals false, and that will ensure that the motion.div is what the user can drag around. So let's try that. Let me go ahead and open up my hero once again. Let me go ahead and hit refresh and see after the animation if we can go ahead and drag these around. So I'm gonna go ahead and move this left one, and you can see I can move that around, and the same is true for my right one. I can move it around as well. So that's a really cool little Easter egg that we can add in there. It would be even cooler though if it would look like our cursors matched the cursors that we see here. And we actually can do that really easily just by adding a CSS value. So coming back into our code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a custom cursor if the user is hovering over this section. It's actually really easy. All we need to do is come up and import the image for that custom cursor. So I'm going to import cursor u image from @/assets/images/cursor_u.svg. And then I should be able to come into my section and say that the style for this section is going to be cursor, and it's going to be my cursor uimage.source, and wrapped around that is going to be URL to make sure that it's giving it the URL of that source. And then the other part of this is just going to be giving this an auto value. So let me go ahead and save that and see if we now have that cursor when we hover over this. And it does look like we do. Let me go ahead and pull this out real quick so you can see that as well. So as we hover over this, now we have that custom cursor that's showing up, and I can drag this around as if I'm in this design program. So that's just a nice little touch that makes it look like we're part of this design. But as soon as I scroll down the page, you can see that my cursor changes back to my normal cursor, and that's kind of a cool effect as well. With that, we've added animations for cursors, for images, and we've created a custom cursor in our hero that creates some great little effects and Easter eggs for our page. So let's move on to animating the next section of our page. Now that we're done with our hero animations, let's move on to animating our logo ticker. Let's go ahead and open up our sections folder and go to our logo ticker.tsx, and then let's see what we need to do to animate this logo ticker. Now what we'd like to do, let me go ahead and close out my sidebar real quick. What we'd like to do is animate the flexed container that's wrapping our logos, animate it left, and make it look like it's an infinite animation. But in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to show 2 times the number of logos so that once we animate this all the way left, we get to the point where it's the start of another copy of our logos. So what we need to do there is go ahead and just basically double our logos by creating a new array. So we'll say array.from length of 2, and just mapping over that using not anything that we're taking from this array, but just the index itself, and just going ahead and showing these logos twice. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in a React fragment here, and that fragment is just going to be the map of our logos. So essentially we have this. We can also add in, we'll say react.fragment here, key equals I. That should keep React happy, or at least TypeScript happy. And it says React is not defined, so we can go ahead and pull that in if we'd like to, or we can just go ahead to the top of our file and import fragment from React, and then we can just change this over to fragment instead of react.fragment. So now that I've done that, after I save, it should go ahead and format that for me so we can see this a little bit better. But essentially, we're just creating an array with a length of 2, and then just doubling the number of logos that we have here. Now that we've done that, we can switch this div over to a motion div and go ahead and animate it infinitely. It's actually very easy after we import our motion div. So let me go ahead and import motion from Framer Motion, and then we'll replace this div with a motion.div, and we'll do the same thing with the ending div. We'll say motion.div there as well. That won't change anything after we save because we haven't done anything except for our render here, where it'll give us an error, and that's because this isn't a client component yet. So let's come to the top of our file and go ahead and say use client, and that'll ensure that this is a client component that can actually use motion from Framer Motion. After I've done that, let me go ahead and scroll back down so we can see our logo ticker, and let's go ahead and add in some animation props. So we're going to say that when this animates, what it's going to do is it's going to move in the X direction by -50%. And we want to do that over a specific period of time. So we'll also give this some transition props so that we can control that animation. So we're going to say the duration for this right for now is just going to be 5 seconds. The ease is going to be linear, and the repeat is going to be infinity to make sure it happens over and over again. So let me go ahead and save that and see what that looks like with these new transition props. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page, and let's just take a look at what this does. So this right now isn't working correctly, and I think that's because the div that surrounds this probably needs to be flexed to give this the full size that it should have. So let me go ahead and try just going ahead and flexing the div surrounding this. We're also going to change this to flex none to make sure that it retains its size. And now we can see that our logos are indeed animating. They're actually animating very, very quickly. So let's go ahead and slow that down a bit by changing the duration to 10 so we can at least see what's going on. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page one more time. So after I refresh this, you can see that this animation starts. What I'm looking for now is I don't want to see a jump after my last logo comes through and it switches back to my quantum logo. So I don't think I saw a jump there, and that's because we have all of the padding in place already. We have the gaps properly set up. So this right now is an infinitely scrolling animation. All we need to do now is basically make sure that we have the correct duration. I think that's probably a little bit fast at 10 seconds. So I'm actually going to slow this down to 30 seconds, hit save one more time, and go ahead and refresh my page and see how that 30-second animation looks. And that looks a lot better. You can see each logo as it scrolls on and off the page, and you're getting that beautiful effect that really is eye-catching for this section. Now that didn't take us long at all, but the animation is beautiful and it's happening perfectly, which means that this section is done from an animation perspective, and it's time to move on to our next section. Now that we're done animating our logo ticker, let's go ahead and animate the introduction section that talks about our layers product. So as we scroll past our logo ticker, you can see that there's this section of text, and what we'd like to do is as we scroll, we'd like for this to stop on the screen instead of allowing us to scroll past it, and we'd like for the words to animate into white one by one as the user scrolls down the page. And then after it's all done animating, we'd like to continue on to the next section. Now this actually is a lot easier than it sounds with Framer Motion and using the sticky effect. So let me show you what we're going to do. The first thing we like to do is go ahead and put all of our content inside of a sticky container. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in another div and go ahead and put my ending div below all of our content. And then we're going to add a class onto this div of sticky top 0. And in fact, we don't even need to say top 0 because we don't really want it to stop at top 0. Let's actually see where we want it to stop. So if we say top 0, then it will stop somewhere around here where our tag is at the top, but it's under the nav bar. So we'll adjust where that top value is. And then we'll go ahead and add another div below this. Now this other div, the only purpose of it is to add height so that this sticky container can stick to the top while this one is scrolling. So for this one, all we're going to do is add a class name and give it a custom height. So in this case, we're going to say that the height of it is going to be 150 VH or 150% of the screen height. And that's all it's going to be there for, is to take up space. So after I save this, what's actually going to happen is as I scroll down, this sticky container is going to stop, and my next part of my scroll, which I'm currently scrolling right here, is just basically scrolling to get this to the top of the screen. And then after I've scrolled all the way past that, then it will continue scrolling down to my next section. So you can see there's a little bit of a scroll period where it's just stuck to the top, and then after that, it continues to scroll. So this just takes up height and allows this to stick to the top of the page. Now let's adjust where that top value is going to be. So I think the top value in this case might just be 28. Let's see if it allows us to do top 28. And let's go ahead and scroll here. That's a little bit too much. Let's try top 20 and see what happens when we do that. Okay, I like that. So we basically, when it gets to top of 80 pixels, it will just stop and allow us to keep scrolling. And then once we've scrolled past this dummy div right here, then it will continue scrolling down the page. So that's a nice effect that leaves that locked to the screen, but of course we want to start to animate our words in. So we want to essentially know what the scroll progress of this is, and we'll use that to decide what our text animation should be. In order to start to do that, let's go ahead and make this a client component. So I'm going to say use client here at the top. And then we're also going to bring in use scroll, which will give us a scroll position indicator for this div. So let's go ahead and import use scroll from Framer Motion. And then at the top of our component, we'll go ahead and say that the const of scroll y progress is going to be equal to use scroll. And then we'll need to give this some options. So we're going to need to set the target for our use scroll. We're also going to want to set, and I'm not sure what that is right offhand, and we haven't defined that yet. So I'm just going to put an empty string there for now. And then I'm going to say the offset, and that's going to be when it should be tracking kind of that 0 to 1 value that it's going to give us. So it's going to be when the start of that div reaches the end of the page until the end of that div reaches the end of the page. And that's what this start, end, end basically signifies. So essentially the entire time that this div right here is sticking to the top of the page, that's what we want to see what that scroll value is. And this is going to give us a progress number between 0 and 1. So as this is sticking, that's basically going to represent a 0% scroll to a 100% scroll. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and set our target. And to create a target, we need to go ahead and use a ref. So I'm going to say const scroll target, and that's going to be equal to use ref from React. If I just hit enter, that should import that. And then I can just add that ref to our scroll target. So I'm going to say ref equals scroll target here, and that should allow us to hook up that ref. Now, it doesn't like that we don't have a type for our use ref at this point. So let me go ahead and add HTML div element, and that should hopefully make TypeScript happy with that ref. And probably need a default value of null as well, just to go ahead and make TypeScript happy. Now that we've done that and we have that ref hooked up, now we can change our target from an empty string to our scroll target, and that should hook all that up as well. In order to understand this scroll y progress value a little bit better, let's go ahead and actually see what value it's giving us. So I'm going to add onto here a use motion value event, and we're going to look at every time that scroll y progress changes, we're going to basically just log it out. So I'm going to say when scroll y progress changes, then it's going to give us the latest value in a function, and we can just basically say console.log latest with the actual value of that latest scroll y progress. Okay, so now that we have that in place, as we scroll, we should be able to see what value it's giving us because it should tell us in the console log. So I'm going to open up my bottom bar here, and it's going to give us this console, and then let's actually see what happens as we scroll. So you can see right now it's at about 33% because it says 0.33, and if we scroll back up, it went down to 31%, then 23%, and I'm still continuing to scroll. Now it's at 6%, and now it's at 0 as it reached the top of the page. So as it scrolls down, as soon as the introduction gets there, that's when it should reach about 1, and that's about what I'm seeing here in our console. And then as soon as it's scrolled past where it's going to the next section, then that's when it should be when it is about to 100% as well. Now that we know what scroll y progress is giving us, I'm going to go ahead and remove my use motion value event and figure out how we're going to use scroll y progress to tell us what word to highlight. The first thing we need to do is we need to break up this text. So right now we have one line of text, but we'd like to break this down into words. So there's about 20 words here if we separate this via spaces. So we need to go ahead and create that value here. So I'm going to say const words is going to be equal to text.split by a space. So anywhere there is a space, it's going to give me a new word, and it's going to take out those spaces. So I'm just going to get the actual words as an array. And then we can insert those words down here instead of text. Now we can go ahead and map over those words and put in that text plus our space. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and replace text with words.map. And for each word, we're going to go ahead and return some JSX, and that is going to be a span that is going to contain essentially my word plus a space to go ahead and make sure that there's a space in between. And then let's go ahead and put our ending span tag there. In order to have a key, we probably need to go ahead and just get the word index and add that as the key, because that's probably the best one that we have. So I'm going to say key equals word index, and that will give us a key that we can use with our span tag. Now, if we save this, let's see if anything has changed. And I don't see anything changed, which is good. That means that we didn't mess anything up with the way that we split our words and now have created them as individual span tags for each word. Now, in order for it to tell us which word to be highlighting, we need to transform our score by progress value, which goes from 0 to 1, to basically a word index where it can tell us what word to be looking at or what word to be highlighting. So we're going to use the use transform hook. This essentially allows us to take a value like scroll by progress, like we're doing here, and transform it from one set of numbers to another. So as it goes from 0 to 1, we're going to want to go from 0 to the words.length value. So it's basically going to tell us which word to be highlighting. So we're going to say const word index is going to be equal to this use transform value. Now we need to know when this changes because Framer Motion is really good at not updating our component, but in this case, we need it to update our component. So we're going to have to save this word index into a state value. In order to do that, let's go ahead and create a state value to save it. So I'm going to say const current word set current word, and we're going to save that to use state. And that use state value is going to take a default of 0. Let's make sure that use state is imported. So use state from React. And then inside of our use effect, we are going to hook up our transformed word index with our state value and make sure that our state properly updates. So I'm going to have a use effect here, and we're going to be looking at our word index, although it shouldn't change. And basically, we're going to be subscribing to this. So we're going to say word index.on change, give us the latest value. We should then go ahead and set our current word based on that latest value. So this word index is going to give us a value between anywhere between 0 and the length of our words. And this current word is going to be the value that we can use right here to update our component based on what the current word is. Let me make sure that use effect is brought into the page. Let me say use effect. And now let's see if we can actually get this to work. In order to do this, I'm just going to add a class name onto here. And I'm going to say that using TW merge, if the word index that we're using here is less than our current word value that we have here, current word, then we're going to add a class to it of text white. So now that we have that in place, let's see what happens when I scroll up and down. So you can see I'm scrolling up here a little bit, and you can see that we're now changing the highlighting of the words based on our scroll position. So it's going to highlight in each individual word, and then as soon as it's all done, it's going to continue scrolling all the way down and go ahead past this section on to the next one after we scroll. So that's a really cool effect, but it would be even nicer if we had a little bit of a transition instead of just instantly changing the text color. So what we'd like to do here is basically add that transition to our TW merge function. So by default, we'll say that we have a transition with a duration of 500, and we'll go ahead and say that by default also the text is white with an opacity of 15% so that it knows what to transition from. And then we can just go ahead and take this off here because this won't matter anymore. After I say that, let's see what that looks like. Let me go ahead and scroll all the way up, come back down, and let's see what happens as we get to this section. So you can see that as we scroll down, it's bringing in these words and highlighting them. And then after it's all done, then it continues to scroll and we start to see the next section. So that same thing is true as we scroll up. It's pausing there and then transitioning our highlighting of our words. So that's a really, really cool effect that we were able to do with a little bit of Framer Motion magic. We were able to use our scroll to track the scroll by progress of a div. And then we were able to transform that from 0 to 1 to the 0 to words.length essentially. And then we were able to set our current word by basically subscribing to this word index here. Now that we've made sure this looks good on mobile, let's make sure it looks good on all of our other views as well. So I'm gonna go over to the tablet view and see how this looks here. And you can see that it's not quite right because now we're covering up a little bit of our tag with our nav bar because our top value isn't quite right. So let me go ahead and adjust that on the medium size. So at the medium size, we'll see if we can use a top value of 28 and see what that looks like. So let me go ahead and try that. I'm going to pull my browser back out a little bit and see what happens when we scroll down. And that holds it to the right spot really well. So I like where that's at. And let's see what happens over in the large size. So in the large size, we can see that as we scroll up and down, we have it coming in correctly. I think I'd like to move this down even a little bit more. So I'm going to say at the large size, let's go ahead and say that the top value is going to be 40. And let's see what that does as far as moving this into the right position. And I really like where that's at. So I think I'll keep it there. That is working really well as well. And it is a really nice effect. That is an incredible effect that we were able to do with a little bit of frame of motion. I really like where this is at. I love how this section turned out, but with that, we still have more animations to go, so let's move on to the next section of the page. Now that we're done with the animation for our introduction section that goes ahead and highlights the words as we scroll, we come down to our features section, and we'd like to be able to animate this as well. So what we're going to do is for each feature card, when those particular cards are hovered, we're going to do something with the image for each of these feature cards. So in real-time collaboration, we're going to show a different avatar. With this interactive prototyping, we're going to show a GIF or video that comes above our incredible word. And for the keyboard quick actions, we're going to make it look like those keys are being pressed. And then for our secondary features, we're also going to give these a slight animation if those get hovered as well. So each of these animations is going to just make a little micro interaction engagement point that we'd like to have our users experience. So in order to start that process, let's go into the source/sections/features page, and we'll go ahead and look at the code that's already in here. So you can see for the real-time collaboration feature card, that's this feature card right here, we have 3 avatars, and then we actually have this 4th avatar that has this div with the 3 dots inside of it. That's what we'd like to use to add in our custom avatar image when that card gets hovered. So what we need to do to get started here is we need to go ahead and come inside of this div that's holding our dots, and we're going to go ahead and put a Next.js image. Now, right now we don't have a source, so we need to go ahead and import a source of a different avatar. So I'm going to come to the top of my file under my other images, and I'm going to import avatar 4 from @/assets/images/avatar. And this one's going to be the Owen Garcia one. And we're going to come back down and stick that inside of our image as the source. So we're going to say avatar 4 right here. The alt for this one is going to be avatar 4, following the pattern of the other image alt tags. And then we're going to have a class name in here. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to make this fill the circle that's already there. So we're going to say the class name is going to be absolute size full, and that should make the image fill that. And we'll go ahead and hit save and see what that looks like. Now, right now, we don't have a relatively positioned div for it to sit inside, so we need to come up to the wrapping div, go ahead and scroll over to the side and say position relative here, and that should solve that problem. We also want to say rounded full to ensure that our image has that 9999 border radius that makes it look circular like the other avatars. Now, TailwindCSS has a really great utility for us to use for this particular interaction. So what we can do is we can label a certain div or a certain component as a group. And then when something happens to that group, like a hover, we can change the styles inside of it based on that hover action. So let's go ahead and label this feature card as a group just by adding the group class. And then down here, what we're going to say is this image is going to have opacity 0 by default, but whenever it's hovered, so when we say group hover, then we're going to say opacity 100 and go ahead and save that. And we'll see if that happens by going ahead and coming over and hovering over our card. Now that's great, but of course we want that to happen with a little bit more of a transition. So I'm going to come over and add in a transition class name here and see what happens when we do that. So let me go ahead back to my card. And yes, you can see that now we do have that transition happening. The other thing we want to do when this is hovered is we want to change this from border transparent to a green border. So I'm going to say group hover here as well and say border green 500. And that should change that to a green border when I hover, so you can see that happen. Of course, we want that to transition as well. So I'm also going to add in my transition class here to add that little bit of transition there. And now when that's hovered, you can see that we add that fourth avatar. Now, the great thing about this particular animation, as well as all the animations for this section, is we're doing them all through CSS. So we're just basing this on things like hovers. We're not actually bringing in framer motion or anything like that in this features section because we don't need it, because we can do all of these things with CSS. Now let's see what TypeScript is unhappy about. It looks like there's a little bit of a problem here. So let me see if I see what that issue is. Let me come inside of my other ones. Okay, so it looks like there's a little bit of problem here because it doesn't like that we didn't use apostrophe here. So we can go ahead and do that. I'll say and or ampersand apostrophe and just go ahead and replace that with that apostrophe HTML entity. Now that we've taken care of that first animation, let's go ahead and see what animation we're going to add to this second feature card. That is our interactive prototyping one, the one I just opened up. So let's go ahead and see what we can do here. So for this one, we are going to import an MP4 that's going to be inside of our assets. That's going to be this GIF incredible.mp4. And you can see that it's just a simple mind-blown GIF. So we're going to use that inside of this to basically show that GIF above the word incredible when this is hovered. So that's going to be pretty simple to do. All we need to do is go ahead and wrap our word incredible in a span tag just to set it apart from the video element that we're going to use. And then we're also going to create a video element here, and we need to go ahead and give it some props. So we are going to have to bring in a source, which we haven't done that yet. So I'll just go ahead and leave that empty for now. We're also going to say autoplay because we want it to autoplay when it's shown. We're going to loop it. It is going to be muted. Plays in line is also going to be in there. And we're going to give this a class name that we're going to get to as soon as we actually bring this video in and see what it looks like. So let me go ahead up to the top and import our video. So I'm going to come below my import key and say import incredible GIF from @/assets/images/GIF incredible.mp4. And it looks like one of the problems is we can't currently import an MP4 into our component. So that means we probably will have to move this into the public directory in order to just be able to reference it like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this GIF incredible.mp4 and actually move it out of my source into public, and it's going to be inside of that. I'll go ahead and create an assets directory for it there as well. So I'm going to say new folder and create assets, and then I'm just going to move this right into there. And then we should have our GIF incredible.mp4 able to be referenced from a relative URL. So instead of importing that there, I'm just going to go ahead and remove that line. I'm going to come into my feature card and go ahead and set the source as /assets/GIF incredible.mp4, and then go ahead and save that. Now you can see that it is adding it in, which is great, but of course we don't want it to be that size, and we want it to have a little bit of a border radius and only show up when we hover. So there's a few things we're going to have to take care of. We're going to take care of all of these through our class names here. So the first thing we're going to do is make this span a relative span so that we can have absolute positioning inside of it. And then for our video, we're going to say that it is absolutely positioned. It is going to be 100% from the bottom. So we're going to say bottom full to push it up top. And then we'll say left 1/2 and then negative translate X 1/2 should push it towards the center of that word. Then we also want to ensure that it has some border radius. So we're going to say rounded 2XL. We'll also put a little bit of shadow under it. So I'm going to say shadow XL. And for now, because we don't want to show it yet, I'm going to say opacity 0. We also want to make sure that if we hover over this for any reason, that we don't actually have the pointer events happening. So we're going to say pointer events none. And that's essentially to make sure that when it's hidden, that we're not doing something like hovering over it here and not able to do things like select our text. Now that that's all in place, we just need to add the group class like we did with our other card onto our feature card. And then we can say that when this is hovered, then we can change our opacity. So we can say group hover opacity 100, and that should increase our opacity when this card is hovered and make this show up. The other thing I'd like to do for this particular card is ensure that we actually make the text around our incredible word a little bit darker when this is hovered as well, just to give it that extra effect. So we're going to say that when this is hovered, we're going to say group hover text white /10. And of course, both of these need a transition. So I'm going to say transition on that one. And I'm also going to say transition on this other one as well, just to make sure that we have a CSS transition in place to make those happen smoothly. Now let's see what happens when we hover this. Then we get our video that transitions onto the page, but it's a very quick transition. So I'd like to slow that down a little bit by saying duration. Maybe we can even say 500 or 700. Let's go with 500 and see how that looks. And I'm going to change my group hover here with the same duration. So I'm going to say duration 500 here as well to change the duration to 500 milliseconds or half a second. So let's see what happens if that duration is set to half a second. And I really like that. I think that looks really nice. So I'm happy with that effect. Now that we've completed that micro interaction, let's move on to our third feature card and see what we're going to do with these keys to make them look like they're being pressed. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is add custom classes to this to say what happens to each of these keys as they're being pressed. So we're going to say class name here, and we're going to give these an outline, and we're going to translate them when they are being quote unquote pressed or when this feature card is being hovered. So what we'll say is we'll say outline lime 400, and we'll also need to say what the outline size is. We'll say outline 2. And I'll go ahead and save that and see what that looks like real quick. And that does outline that key, but we want to offset that a little bit as well. So we're going to say outline offset 4 to go ahead and offset that outline that we see. We want to do the same thing with all of our keys though. So let me go ahead and copy and paste this class here and go ahead and add a class name on each of our other keys to do the exact same thing. So we're going to outline our second key and of course outline our third key. Now this is only going to happen when the card is hovered, but for now we're just kind of seeing what this looks like so that we can get this to work. The other thing we'd like to do is we'd like to go ahead and translate these in the Y direction. So we're going to say translate Y1. And you can see that that gives it that little bit of a press look. So we're going to do the same thing for all the other ones. So translate Y1, and for the third one, translate Y1 as well. So those all look like they have that little bit of that pressed effect. Now to get this to happen when the card is hovered, of course, we need to add in, once again, our group class. And then we can say that some of these things only happen when the group is hovered. So for outline, we can say group hover outline to ensure that the outline only shows up when the group is hovered. So I'll do the same thing for the second one. And of course, same thing for the third one. Group hover outline should ensure that the outline only shows up when they're hovered. So let's see what that looks like. And yes, we do see that that's happening, but it's an instant shift. We want it to be a little bit of a transition. So we'll go ahead and add a transition class here. And hopefully that does the transition for the outline. We'll see. And a third transition here. And let's go ahead and see what we've got. So no, that doesn't transition the outline. And I think it's because instead of transitioning from no outline to outline, I think we need to transition the outline color. So what we'd like to do is basically say that the outline is going to be transparent like that. And then when the group is hovered, then we go to outline lime 400. And in fact, I'll just go ahead and take off these other outlines here like so, just to make sure that we don't have that in place anymore. So basically when the group is hovered, it should change the color and hopefully it'll transition that color. So let's see what happens this time. So I'm going to go ahead, come in here and try and hover it and see if anything changes. I'm not seeing it change, and it looks like I completely took my outline off altogether. So I need to add those back on. My bad on that one. So let me go ahead and add on outline to make sure it's always there. And go ahead and save that one more time, come back here and see what happens. So now we have a slight transition from transparent to green on the first one. So let's go ahead and just change that duration to a little bit longer by adding on duration 500 to ensure that we have a better transition effect. And we might have to also say transition all because it doesn't look like it's actually really transitioning that. Okay, so there we go. Now it's a very smooth effect as we hover over that card. Now that we've done that, let's apply that same style to all the other keys. So I'm going to take my transition and say that it needs to be transition all, and then also duration 500 should set it to the same duration. We also want to make sure that we have the outline transparent rule here. So I'm going to say outline transparent. And then when our group is hovered, we'll say outline lime 400. And we'll do the same thing for the third one, outline transparent, and then group hover outline lime 400, and go ahead and save that and see what that looks like. Okay, so now that we've done that, if we hover over this, we should see our keys lighting up with that outline, but we'd also like to make the translate that's happening at the end here happen only when it's hovered as well. And in fact, what I'm going to do here, I'd like to word wrap this just so we can see a little bit better our classes that we're adding on each one of these instead of going out to the end of the line. So let's go ahead and do the same thing here. So we'll say group hover translate Y1, and I'm just going to press Command D on the Mac or Control D on Windows and say group hover translate Y1 on both of those as well. So as soon as I do that, I should notice them going down and being pressed at the same time when I hover. Now that's good, but it could be just a little bit better if we delayed our animation on our second and third keys. So I'd like to go ahead and do that by adding in an animation delay. So we can say delay 150 on our second key for just a slight delay of 150 milliseconds. And then our third key will say delay 300 for 300 milliseconds of delay. And let's see what that looks like versus what we had. So I'm going to go ahead and hover over this. And now you can see that it looks like the keys are being pressed. And when I release it, it looks like the keys are being let up one at a time. That's a really smooth, good effect. I'm really happy with where that's at, which means we can move on to animating our secondary features. For the secondary features, we're not going to do too much. All we're going to do is basically when we hover them, we'd like the star to rotate, and we'd also like the individual feature to grow just a little bit. So in order to make that happen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say when this is hovered, we're going to scale this to 105, which is basically just 5% up. And we're also going to add a transition with a duration of 500, just like the others. And let's see what that looks like when we hover over one of these. So you can see that they grow just a little bit. That's a cool effect. We'd also like the star to rotate at the same time. So in order to make that happen, we'll also use that group class from Tailwind. And then we'll basically come to our span tag and say that when the group is hovered, then we'll add a rotate 45 on here. And we also want this to transition as well. So we'll say transition and duration 500 there as well. So let's see what that looks like. Let's come back and hover each of these, and you can see that they give that nice grow with the rotate. That looks really great. I'm really happy with what we've done with the animations for this section. Not only did we do all of these in CSS, but we added some great looking animations that really create micro interactions that help people be engaged with this section. So I'm really happy with how all of these turned out, and I hope you are as well. With that though, let's move on to the next section of our animations. Now that we're done with our features animations, it's time to move down to our integrations. And what we're going to do for our integrations is we're going to have these integration columns. They're going to be scrolling similarly to how we had our logo ticker scrolling, only these are going to be scrolling vertically. So let's see how we're going to make that happen. Let's go into source, into our sections, and open up our integrations.tsx file. And you can see that we have our integrations here on the top. It looks like we don't need this next image because we didn't use it anymore, but we're importing our integration columns. And I think that's where all of our integrations, including our animation, are going to be stored. So let's go ahead inside of that integration column component, and let's take a look at what we can change here to ensure that our integration animation can happen. Now, much like with our logo tickers, we want our integrations to go from bottom to top. So really it's this outer div, this flex call div right here that we want to be able to animate in the Y direction. So let's see if we can go ahead and make that happen. Let's go ahead and import motion from Framer Motion. And then we're going to switch this outer div that holds our integrations to a motion.div. And we're going to do the same thing with our ending div down here. We're going to switch this to an ending motion.div. When we save, of course, nothing will have happened yet because we haven't added any animations, except for the fact that our app once again can't render because we haven't told Next.js yet that this is a client component. So of course we need to come up to the top of our file and say use client to ensure that this is a client component that can handle a motion div. Let's go ahead and scroll back down to our integrations, and we can see that nothing has really changed here. it's waiting for us to add some animation to our motion div. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and say that our animation or animate prop is going to be equal to y negative 50%. And let's see what happens when we do that. Of course, we're going to see it happen really quickly, but what we want is for all of our integrations to scroll to the top, and we want another bunch of integrations that are exactly the same to come behind them so that we get the infinite loop effect. And for that to happen, we need to go ahead and wrap these integrations with an array to basically double the number of integrations that we have. So we can do that by just saying basically array.from length of 2, and then we can just map over each of those, taking the index, which is represented by I here, and basically just going ahead and creating a React fragment out of each of those with a key of that index. Now, once we do that, we can move our integrations into that array, which basically doubles the number of integrations that will be showing on the screen. Now, it looks like the problem here is that I used the wrong kind of bracket. We need to return that fragment onto the screen. So I need to change the kind of bracket to a parentheses there. Now, after that's the case, we should be able to see our animation actually happen. So let's go ahead and add a transition prop, and that transition prop is basically going to control the duration, which for now, let's just go ahead and make that 5 seconds. Let's say that the repeat is going to be infinity to make it happen over and over again, and that the ease is going to be linear so that we don't speed up and slow down the animation as it's happening. So let me go ahead and save that, refresh my page, and see what we get once that happens. So you can see that now the animation is happening, and actually it's happening correctly. So I'm not seeing any kind of jumps. It is a little fast, so I am going to slow it down. So we'll change the duration to 10, but it certainly is happening, and it's happening well. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, refresh my page, and see if we can slow down that animation some so that we see all of our integrations and have enough time to actually read what's happening with these different integrations. And in fact, we can go ahead and slow this down just a little bit more. I'm actually going to slow this down to 15 and see if that helps it be more readable, especially at the mobile size. So after I refresh that, we can see that when the animation starts, you have these integrations that are moving from the bottom to the top in an infinite manner. So basically, once it shows the first set of integrations, it's basically just starting over with the list and going to negative 50% again, starting over at 0, and then going to negative 50% again. So that all looks great. However, there are a couple of things that we haven't accounted for yet. One of those things is going to be the fact that if we have two separate columns, we want to be able to tell our integration column that we want the animation to be able to be reversed. In order to make that happen, we need to be able to take in a reverse prop. So I'm going to add a reverse prop here, and this is going to be a Boolean that we can pass into our integration column. And then if the animation is going to be reversed, that means that instead of going to y negative 50%, in that case, we would go to y 50%. So what we can do here is just add a ternary statement that says reverse, and if it's true, we do 50%, and if it's not true, we do negative 50%. And we also need to be able to destructure that from our prop so that that variable actually exists. And after I do that, I should be able to pass in the reverse prop. So let me go back to my integration section and see if I can pass in the reverse prop for my second integration column. So I'm going to say reverse here. You don't need to add any value. Just having it there is enough for that to work. After I do that, let me go ahead and refresh and see if that still works as it should. So now I'm seeing my integrations moving off of the screen, and then I'm guessing they're going to come back like they just did, which isn't exactly what we want. So let me go back to my integrations column and see how we can fix this to make this work. So what we need to do is we need to add an initial value. So initially, we want the y value to be 0 normally, but if this is a reversed one, we're going to actually want this to start from negative 50 and go to 0 instead of the normal starting from 0 and going to negative 50. So I'm going to say reverse. If that's true, we're going to want this to be negative 50%. And if it's not true, we can start at 0. And then for down here, we can say that if it's reversed, we're actually just going to 0. So we're going to go from negative 50% to 0. And if it's false, we're going to go the opposite direction. So let's go ahead and refresh this now and see if this works. So now we see this column is coming down and it's able to be correctly animated because we were able to add the correct initial props and the correct animate props depending on if our animation is reversed or not. This is looking great so far. Let me go ahead and pull out my browser window and see if my desktop view is also looking as good as my tablet view is. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page just to get a better look at this. But it looks like when the animation starts, I'm seeing a great animation. They are fading on and off the screen. They're going in two different directions. So that's a really nice section and a really nice animation for that section. Now that we've completed our integrations section animation, it's time for us to move down to our FAQs. This will be a pretty fun section to work with. So let's see what we need to do here inside of our FAQs to make this work. Let me go into my sections and into FAQs, and let's see what we think we need to change here in order to get these FAQs to be able to animate as someone clicks through each FAQ. So one thing we'd like to do, it looks like it doesn't like the fact that we've used this apostrophe without the HTML entity. So I'm going to add an and APOS semicolon, and that should allow that TypeScript error to go away. But other than that, we see that we have some FAQs, and each one has a question and an answer. And of course, if it's not the selected index, then we're hiding that particular answer. Well, that's fine. Let's go ahead and see how we can edit this to make this actually animate to those different answers. The first thing we need to do is probably have some kind of state holding our selected index. So let me go ahead and make this a client component. I'm going to come up to the top of my file and say use client. That ensures that Next.js doesn't throw a fit when we actually use some JavaScript here. And then I'm going to change my selected index to a React state. So I'm going to say const selected index set selected index is equal to use state, and I'm going to hit enter to import that from React, and then just go ahead and give that a default value of 0. After I've saved that, nothing should change about the page right away, but we'd like to make some changes when the selected index changes. The first thing we'd like to do is be able to change the selected index when either the question is clicked or the plus sign is clicked. So in order to do that, we need to add an on-click handler to this wrapping div in order to change our selected index dynamically. So what we can say here is on click, and of course we're going to run a function. That function is basically going to set the selected index to the current value that we're looking at with our FAQ index. So you can see we're mapping over our FAQs. We're getting that index out. So we can just go ahead and set that to the FAQ index, and that should ensure that we update our state appropriately. And as soon as I save that, you can see that it reformats. And then let's see if this works by going ahead and clicking another one of these questions. And yes, indeed, that does seem to work. Next on our list of kind of animation features here is to animate this SVG and not have it change instantly, but have it kind of rotate over from our plus sign. So we're already rotating it by 45 degrees, but it would be great if that transitioned instead. So what we're going to do is basically just add in a transition class name here, and then we'll say duration 300, and that should ensure that instead of just rotating, it actually transitions over 300 milliseconds. So let's click this one and see that that rotation happens, and then when it goes away, it should rotate back to our plus. That's happening perfectly. The last thing we want to be able to do is make sure that our answer shows up with an animation rather than having it show up instantly. And for this, we'll use animate presence. So we know that we have this hidden right here, but essentially what we'd like to do is probably just completely remove it from the page if it's not the selected index. So we're going to change this around, and we're going to say that we're only going to show this div if it's the currently selected index. So we're going to wrap this in a selected index equals the FAQ index. So basically if our state equals the FAQ index, then we'll go ahead and show that div. Otherwise, we won't. So I'm going to go ahead and take this, copy and paste it inside of that statement, hit save to reformat, and then I just need to remove this selected index hidden rule here because we no longer need that because we're essentially just removing it completely from the page. What we can do then is go ahead and wrap this in animate presence to say that it can animate on and off the page. So I'm going to come to the top of my file, and I'm going to import animate presence from Framer Motion, and then we can wrap that div in this animate presence component. And I'm going to go ahead and stick the ending animate presence after our selected index check. But animate presence can only animate motion divs, so we also need to change this to a motion div. So I'm going to say motion.div here, and my ending div is going to be replaced with motion.div as well. I also need to import that motion from Framer Motion. So I'm going to come to the top of my file and do the same thing. I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion as well and come back down, and we can see that now we have our motion div on the page. With that animate presence, it allows us to go ahead and have an initial prop that we can use. We also will have an animate prop that we can use, and we'll have an exit prop that we can use to control what happens to this motion div as it animates on and off the screen. So what we'll want to do is basically say that initially the height of this will be 0 and that the margin top for this will be 0. And then when we animate it, we'll animate it to the values that it currently has. So the height is going to be auto, and the margin top is going to be what's represented by MT6, which is 1.5 rems or 24 pixels. We'll just use 24. And our exit prop is going to animate it back out to height 0 and margin top 0. That should allow this animation to happen smoothly, but let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when we click one of our FAQ questions. So you can see that it's doing an okay job. The only problem is that we have this overflow that we would like to wrap around this motion div to make sure that none of the text is able to overflow outside of it. So I'm going to say overflow hidden, and we don't even need our MT6 anymore because that's all being handled now by Framer Motion. So after I save that, and let's see what happens when we animate one of these, and you can see that yes, now they are animating very smoothly on and off the page. Every time we click one of these questions, we're able to see this answer, and it's animating in a really smooth way. With that, let's take a quick look at our tablet and desktop views to make sure that those look good as well, but I think they will. Let's go ahead and see that those are animating on and off the page well, and those are, and as we move over to the desktop view, it looks like that's animating perfectly as well. This is a subtle animation that people may not recognize at first, but with it, it just feels so much smoother, and it has a different level of polish than when you don't put these kinds of animations in. So I'm a big fan of this particular animation. I hope you enjoyed building that with me. With that, it's time to move on to the last animated section of the page. Now that we're done with the FAQs animation, it's time to handle the last animation on the page, which is our call to action animation. So let's go into our sections and go into call to action and see what we need to do from there. Now, one thing that's pretty obvious is we are going to be changing this flexed div, and we're going to be animating it to the left. And we've done this before with our logo ticker, so we're going to use a very similar animation here to enable this particular animation to happen. So let's go up to the top of our file and import motion from Framer Motion. And of course, because this is becoming a client component, because we are using state and JavaScript and all that, we will need to add the use client directive to keep Next.js happy with our non-server rendered component. After that, let's go ahead and replace this div, our flexed div, with motion.div. And then we're going to replace the ending div with ending motion.div. And after we do that, nothing changed yet, but we can now add our animate prop in here. So we're going to say that the animation is going to be in the X direction, we're going to go negative 50%. And to handle how that transition happens, we'll use the transition prop, and we'll say that the duration is going to be 30 seconds. The ease is going to be linear, and the repeat is going to be infinity. Now that we have that set up, let's see what this animation looks like. And right now it looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and see if it makes it all the way through the animation without any jumps or any other problems. So far, this is my third try it for free call to action. I'm waiting for number 5 because that's where it's going to jump, because there's 10 of these in line. So let's see if there's a jump after number 5. So this is number 5, not seeing any jump, which is definitely encouraging. That's the end of number 5. We're on to number 6. Oh, and there was a little bit of jump there. I don't know if you saw it or not, but that means we need to change a little bit about our styles. So you can see we have a gap of 64 pixels in between our different items, but we need some kind of padding at the end to account for having the space in between to allow this scroll to happen in an infinite fashion. So I just need to say PR16 as well, and that should add the extra padding to the end that will allow this to look like an infinite animation with 0 jumps. Now that we've created this motion div that has our animation attached to it, what we'd like to do is be able to slow this animation down if we hover over it. And that's actually going to force us to take a little bit of a different approach using the same props, but basically using it within an animate function. And I'll show you what I mean here in 1 second. So what I'm going to do is import use animate from Framer Motion. And then we're going to bring that into our component. So I'm going to say use animate, and use animate is a hook that gives us back a couple of variables, those being our scope that we want to attach this animation to and the animate function that we want to use to create the animation. So the scope that we're going to attach it to is our motion div. So I'm going to say ref equals scope right here. And then we're going to have to run our animate function inside of a React use effect. So I'm going to bring in a use effect, just going to hit enter to import that use effect from React. And then we're going to run a function that calls our animate function using our scope.current, and it's going to recreate essentially what we've already created. So we're going to say that the X is going to go to negative 50%, and the transition is the third argument that we pass in here, and that's going to be the same. So duration 30, ease linear, and repeat infinity. After we define that, that means that we don't need the animate or transition props anymore, because now that's being handled by our animate function that's being run inside of our use effect. So if I save that and refresh my page, hopefully we'll see that the animation still runs, and indeed it does. Now we went through that refactor so that we could get the result of this animation function. So I'm actually going to save the result of this function in a variable. And I want to save this in a variable that's not going to force my component to re-render. So that means I need to use a React ref. So I'm going to say const animation is going to be equal to use ref from React. And it's going to be a default value of null when it's not there. And then I simply need to say animation.current is equal to animate. And it doesn't like the fact that we have this animation playback controls not assignable to our ref. So we just need to tell this ref that it could be animation playback controls from Framer Motion, and that fixes our type error. So now when the animation function runs, it's going to give us back this animation as a variable that we can then use to change the animation dynamically based on what we want to do. So in order to just test that out real quick, what we can do is we can actually just go ahead and do that. We can say animation.current.speed is equal to 0.5 or 1/2, and then hit save. And you'll see that now the speed has slowed down because we dynamically changed it through our ref variable that we saved. So now we have the control of this animation to be able to change it dynamically anytime that we want, which is great. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that from the page. And now we're going to only change it when we hover over this motion.div. In order to add some hover state to this motion div, let's go ahead and do a couple of things here. Let's go ahead and add an on mouse enter function that is going to run, and we want an on mouse leave. And then for each of these, we're just going to run a function that's going to set whether the text is hovered or not. So we need a way to save that state. That's going to be up here. So I'm going to say const is hovered, set is hovered. It's going to be equal to use state from React with a default value of false. And then when our mouse enters here, we're going to say set is hovered to true. And when our mouse leaves, we're going to run a function that changes that value to set is hovered false. Let's go ahead and save that. One of the things we want to make sure is that we're not continually running this animation function over and over. So we want to add a dependencies array here that's empty. That should hopefully allow us to only run that the first time we render this component rather than every single time. So let me go ahead and refresh this and make sure that everything is working the way that it should. So far, it looks like it is. Now to add in that change for our hover value, let's go ahead and add another use effect. And this use effect is going to listen to when the hover value changes. So in our dependency array, it's going to say is hovered. And every time this changes, it's going to set our animation speed. So we're going to say if we have an animation.current value, then if it's hovered, then we want to set the animation.current.speed to 0.5. Otherwise, or else, set the animation.current.speed to 1. So back to 100%. So let's go ahead and save this and actually see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page. We should see our animation happening. And then when we hover that, we should see it slow down. When our mouse leaves, it should speed up again. Slow down, speed up, slow down, speed up. So that works really well. The last thing we want to do for that particular call to action is go ahead and change the color of our text when this group is hovered as well. So I'm going to say group here. And then we just need to change our span tag here to say class name equals group hover. And then we're going to change it to text lime 400. So anytime that group is hovered, all of our text is going to change to this lime 400 color. So let's go ahead and try it out by hovering our text, and we can see it change. And same thing again, hover a text, see it change. That works well. So let's look at it on all three different sizes. So we have that down here on our mobile view. It's definitely, you can see it hover and change. The same thing is true for our tablet view. It slows down and it hovers. And for our desktop view, it does the same thing, slows down on hover and changes color as well. Now this would ideally be a button because it's a call to action, or at least a link. So we might want to add a link around here if we had somewhere for this link to go. But for now, we don't need to worry about that. We'll just go ahead and leave this as is. We could simply set a cursor pointer rule, and this will make it feel more like a link. So if we set that cursor pointer rule, when we hover this, it should change our cursor to a pointer and allow it to feel like you're about to click on something that's going to go somewhere. Now with that, we've animated every single section of our page and it looks absolutely amazing. Every section has things that draw the user in to take a closer look at what we've created. It's really an impressive site when it comes down to it. I hope you've enjoyed this build with me. If you have, make sure and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.